It was supposed to be fine. Life seems sufficient. The choices make sense, there are no obvious lacks, and yet something inside remains unfilled. Billy Graham observed that one of the hardest discomforts to admit arises exactly there, when a person looks around and realizes there is no clear problem to explain this emptiness. Everything is in its expected place, the path taken seems right, but the inner feeling doesn't follow. The question is not born from crisis, but from strangeness. If nothing is missing, why isn't it enough? This emptiness often causes confusion because it doesn't come with visible losses. The person looks at their own life and recognizes that many things are working. There is structure, there is routine, there are achievements that at another time seemed enough to guarantee emotional stability. Even so, the inner feeling doesn't match that image. The conflict is born from expectation. At some point, an implicit agreement was created. When certain things were resolved, well-being would come along with them. When life was organized, when efforts were recognized, when there were no major problems to face, then it would be possible to relax inside. But that moment arrives, and what is felt is not relief. Many people live in this state in silence, not because they want to hide it, but because they struggle to justify what they feel. How do you talk about emptiness when nothing seems to be missing? How do you explain a discomfort that has no clear cause? Compared to other stories, one's own life can even seem privileged. This generates guilt, embarrassment, and often denial. This emptiness doesn't show up as deep sadness or constant discouragement. It appears as a lack of involvement. The person participates in their own life, but finds it hard to feel truly connected to what they are living. Days pass, commitments are fulfilled, conversations happen, but something remains distant. Because it doesn't produce obvious suffering, this conflict is often ignored. The person keeps going, telling themselves that this is normal, that it's part of adult life, that maybe they are asking too much of themselves. These explanations help them keep functioning, but they don't touch the center of the issue. Over time, the emptiness becomes part of the background. It doesn't prevent decisions or paralyze actions. It simply accompanies. It is present in moments of pause, in small breaks during the day, when there is nothing urgent to occupy attention. In those moments, the uncomfortable feeling arises that something should be there, but isn't. This conflict is more common than it seems. It doesn't choose disorganized people or chaotic lives. It appears precisely where there is structure, predictability, and control, where everything seems sufficient on the outside but doesn't translate into fullness on the inside. And that's why so many live with this emptiness without ever naming it, believing they should be fine even when they aren't. Billy Graham observed this kind of emptiness with great care. For him, it wasn't a matter of ingratitude, weakness, or an inability to value what one has. He saw this state as a sign of something deeper, a gradual disconnection between the life that was built and the inner experience of being alive within it. In the way he understood human beings, Billy Graham noticed that many people learn to organize their lives well. They make responsible decisions, build stability, avoid unnecessary conflicts. All of this creates an external sense of security, but that same organization can, little by little, take up all the available space, leaving little room for inner listening. He believed that emptiness arises when attention is turned almost exclusively toward keeping everything functioning. The person begins to live according to expectations, goals, and responsibilities, but loses contact with what they feel while fulfilling all of it. Not because they have no feelings, but because there is no time, habit, or space to perceive them clearly. Billy Graham spoke often about inner awareness as a simple form of presence, not as a technique, nor as a deliberate effort, but as the ability to notice one's own inner state. When this awareness weakens, life can continue to be correct, productive, and stable, yet internally something begins to be missing. Not things, not people, not experiences. What is missing is lived meaning. For him, emptiness was not an enemy to be fought. It was an indicator. It showed that the person was living more from what was expected of them than from what was actually being experienced inside. The problem was not having built a functional life, but having drifted away from one's own perception along the way. Billy Graham also observed that this emptiness often appears precisely when a person reaches what they were striving for, when goals are achieved, when conflicts diminish, when life enters a certain balance. It is at this moment that the expectation of now everything should make sense collides with an inner feeling that does not follow that logic. In his view, this did not mean that something needed to be discarded or redone. It simply meant that something had been set aside, personal listening. Without it, life can look complete on the outside and still be lived with a constant sense of absence on the inside. Billy Graham did not offer quick answers for this state. He simply pointed to a human reality that is often ignored. It is possible to have enough and still feel empty. Not because something is wrong, but because the connection with one's inner life has gradually weakened while life itself was being carefully built. In modern life, this emptiness finds fertile ground to remain unquestioned. The day is filled with tasks, deadlines, commitments, and constant small decisions. Everything demands attention. Everything asks for a response. The person learns to remain active, organized, and functional. This ensures stability, but it also occupies almost all the available inner space. Work, even when it is not excessive, consumes a significant portion of emotional energy. It demands continuous presence, adaptation, and engagement. At the end of the day, there is a sense of duty fulfilled, but not necessarily a sense of inner satisfaction. The body stops, but the mind remains in functioning mode. Outside of work, routine continues to be structured. There are responsibilities, stable relationships, agreements kept. Life follows a predictable rhythm. To an outside observer, everything seems to be on track. And in fact, it is. The problem is that this organization does not guarantee emotional involvement. It guarantees continuity. Over time, the person begins to measure their own state by comparing themselves to others. They observe more difficult stories, more unstable paths, more visible conflicts. In comparison, the emptiness seems unjustifiable. The idea arises that one should not feel this way. This comparison brings no relief. It only deepens the difficulty of admitting what is felt. Billy Graham observed that this kind of comparison is common in organized lives. When there is no obvious pain to point to, discomfort is treated as exaggeration or ingratitude. The person begins to distrust their own inner experience. They learn to ignore it in order not to seem inadequate. Even moments of rest end up being filled. There are enough distractions to occupy any gap. Free time turns into consumption, stimulation, constant occupation. Little space remains to perceive the emptiness clearly. It is still there, but diluted between one activity and another. Perhaps you have already noticed this in simple moments. A weekend that passes too quickly. A pause that does not bring renewal. A pleasant encounter that even so does not fully fill you. There is nothing wrong with these moments. They simply reveal that emptiness is not linked to a lack of activities, but to the way life is being lived internally. Modern life makes it easy to maintain this state. It values performance, stability, and adaptation. Little is said about lived meaning, and so many people move forward believing they are fine because everything functions, while carrying a persistent sense of absence that finds no place to be acknowledged. There are moments when the day finally loses its momentum. Tasks come to an end. Messages stop. Obligations are suspended for a few hours. The person finds themselves alone with their own time. There is nothing urgent to solve, no immediate decisions, no one waiting for a response. It is in this space that emptiness usually shows itself more clearly, not as a carefully formed thought, nor as a conscious conclusion. It appears as a feeling that is hard to push away. The person realizes that, even without external pressure, they cannot feel fulfilled. Physical rest happens, but it is not accompanied by inner calm. The environment is familiar. The place is the same as always. Nothing there has changed. And yet, there is a difficulty settling inwardly. The body slows down, but the inner experience remains strange, as if something were out of place, even without a clear reason. In these moments, the idea from the cover returns almost automatically. I should be fine. Life is organized. Nothing is missing. Still, the feeling does not follow this logic. There is no crisis, no despair. There is only an absence that becomes more noticeable when there are not enough distractions to fill it. The person tries to fill this space with simple stimuli. Background noise, a screen turned on, something that helps pass the time without having to feel too much. It doesn't always work. Sometimes it only postpones contact with what insists on remaining. When everything around quiets down, it becomes harder to sustain the idea that everything is fine. Not because something is wrong, but because emptiness finds room to be felt without interruption. It asks for no explanation. It demands no answer. It simply makes itself present. This is one of the few moments when the person realizes they have been carrying this feeling for longer than they imagined. During the day, it is diluted by constant functioning. At night, when there is nothing left to maintain, it appears more clearly, revealing a fatigue that is not linked to effort, but to the absence of lived meaning. When this emptiness is kept at the margins for too long, it begins to influence the way a person lives, even without being directly recognized. It does not appear as intense suffering, nor as a visible crisis. It acts continuously, shaping the inner rhythm through which everything is experienced. The person continues doing what needs to be done. They maintain routine, sustain relationships, respond to daily demands. On the outside, everything seems stable. On the inside, involvement slowly decreases. Experiences leave fewer deep marks. Good moments do not linger. Days pass with a sense of repetition that finds no clear explanation. This state creates an emotional wear that is difficult to name. It is not ordinary exhaustion. It is a fatigue tied to the lack of lived meaning. Energy is not drained by conflicts or problems, but by the constant effort to maintain the appearance that everything is fine. The person learns to function even without feeling. Billy Graham observed that when emptiness is ignored, it does not remain neutral. It begins to affect the way a person relates to themselves. An inner distance emerges. It becomes harder to recognize what is being felt. Emotions grow less accessible, not because they have disappeared, but because they find no space to express themselves. Over time, this can generate a sense of estrangement from one's own life. The person looks at what they have built and recognizes that everything makes sense on paper, yet they cannot feel fully part of it. There is a constant impression of following a script that works, but does not touch something essential. Ignoring this state for long periods also affects the ability to rest. Even during pauses, even in moments of leisure, the emptiness remains. Free time does not fill. It only exposes the absence that had been covered by the constant movement of days. This wear does not ask for immediate solutions. It asks for recognition. When that does not happen, the person keeps moving forward, carrying a weight they cannot explain. A weight that does not come from the lack of something external, but from the difficulty of feeling connected to what they are living. At this point, emptiness stops being just an occasional feeling and becomes part of life's background. It does not paralyze, it does not shout. It simply accompanies, gradually consuming the capacity to feel present, involved, and truly alive within one's own experience. At some point, without the person seeking it, a clearer perception arises. Not as an answer nor as a solution, but as a simple understanding. Having a structured life does not by itself guarantee the feeling of being well inside. This realization does not come with immediate relief. It merely reorganizes the way one looks at their own inner state. Billy Graham drew attention to this kind of perception as a point of awareness, not something to be rushed into or turned into an explanation, just acknowledged. The difference between having and feeling, between keeping everything functioning and truly being present in one's own life. At this deeper level, the person begins to notice that emptiness is not linked to a lack of events, people, or achievements. It is linked to the way all of this is lived internally. The body participates, the mind organizes, but emotional presence seems partial, as if it were always slightly behind what is happening. This perception does not accuse, it does not point out failures. It does not invalidate the life that was built. It simply shows that something important was placed in the background for too long. Personal listening. The ability to notice one's own state without trying to correct it, justify it, or minimize it. When this awareness appears even briefly, it does not resolve the emptiness, but it changes the relationship with it. The discomfort stops being just something unpleasant and becomes a sign that there is a distance between living correctly and feeling involved in what is being lived. This layer does not ask for immediate action. It does not ask for decisions. It simply invites attention. To notice how one is living what on the outside seems sufficient, and this attention, even if subtle, already changes the way emptiness is carried. Perhaps the phrase on the cover is not an accusation, but a tired acknowledgement. I should be fine, and yet something still doesn't fill. Billy Graham observed that many human states cannot be explained by the logic of lack or excess. Sometimes emptiness appears not because something is missing, but because the person gradually drifted away from their own experience while learning how to keep everything in order. This reflection does not end here. It usually continues in ordinary days, when life keeps functioning. But the question returns in simple moments without drama. Not to be answered, but to be noticed more honestly. I suggest that you subscribe to the channel to continue following reflections offered at this calm pace, with depth, focused on human experiences that rarely find space in everyday life, always inspired by the attentive way Billy Graham observed the inner lives of people. This channel exists for those who feel the need to think more carefully, without haste, and without ready-made conclusions. If at any point in this video you recognized yourself, the comments are open as a simple space for expression. It can be a short sentence, a perception, or just a note of what stayed with you. Sometimes putting it into words is already a way of not going through this state alone.